officer who had carried me from the boat, the curious crowd fell back respectfully, and I passed on board. Notwithstanding our position was one calculated to repress every emotion except astonishment, I found Captain Brent in a tremendous state of wrath, and the steward was describing the heathenish country to which we had drifted, in a flight of profanity that was positively eloquent. On learning the cause, I found that the last named dignitary had been out in the city trying to purchase fresh meats and vegetables, of which the men stood in great need after their long voyage. It seemed, though, that neither gold nor silver would be accepted in payment, and so the dinner of fresh victuals that all had looked forward to so eagerly was not in sight. We were soon relieved, however, by the appearance of a van load of fresh supplies, which the vendor said was brought on order from the Marine Office. I retired to my cabin and tried to collect my thoughts. I had been but a few hours in this wonderful country, and already my senses had taken in more, it seemed to me, than my mind could analyze and digest in weeks. I felt as if I would like to get away from myself, or away by myself for 2 or 3 days and just think it over. Everything was so new and so strange that all mental effort was directed to grasping the situation. To be continued. Okay, The Iron Public Continued by J.E. Barrington and Captain Brent by Richard Jameson Morgan. All rights reserved. This is Chapter 3 Continued. After a dinner of fresh meats and vegetables, the first we had tasted since we left America, I was called on by Professor Morris, a fine-looking gentleman, apparently about 65 years old, who came aboard with the burgomaster of the city and several other persons of position, and welcomed us all to the Iron Republic. Our countryman seemed delighted to see us, and he was, to me, the one link that connected us with a former world, and imparted reality to scenes and circumstances that would otherwise have seemed an illusion. After an hour's conversation in which the voyage was discussed, and in which I learned that he had come through the barriers by the same channel that we had, he left us saying that he would call in the evening and take Captain Brent and myself to the opening of the new temple, where we would have the opportunity to see the president and meet him afterwards. Professor Morris was of the same opinion as myself in regard to the permanency of the strait which brought us through the barriers, but he thought it probable that it might be gorged with ice and remain closed for years at a time. Indeed, he thought that it was perhaps only open at rare intervals when the seas were unusually clear of ice. However that may be, I found the strait open both going and coming, except for the current experienced no difficulty whatsoever in getting through, and it is my opinion, based on a theory which I have formed and which will be fully explained in my forthcoming book, that there is yet another passage through these barriers which may be found, if it is sought for, with half the ardor that has been devoted to Arctic explorations. We accompanied Professor Morris to witness the opening of the new temple that evening, and as we took our places in the tier of seats set apart for visitors and strangers, I never gazed upon a finer interior or saw a more superior audience. From pit to gallery was such an array of female toilets as was never dreamed of in America. I guess that would be toyers. Anyway, indeed, it seems to me, as my eyes swept over the magnificent auditorium, some grand pageant prepared in honor of a royal Mardi Gras or fete. The costumes of the ladies were similar in style and richness to those of the most superb ballet, and every gentleman was in full dress with knee breeches, ruffles, and buttoneer. What seemed remarkable to me was that the people in the last gallery were just as handsomely dressed as any in the house. I called Professor Morris's attention to this, and he informed me that there were no social differences in any part of the house, that the seats were all drawn by lot, and the most distinguished person in the city might draw a seat in the gallery, while a hod carrier got the best in the house. As a matter of fact, he said, it would be so difficult to make social distinctions, as the President of the Republic was a brick mason. Reader's note, we are seeing and hearing a lot of different sort of temple and brick mason propaganda, so just be that as it may. When this thing was written, and especially like when Zetetic Astronomy was written, there's a lot of contention in terms of, Robotham being a Mason and this person and that person being a Mason, but in all actuality, and again, this is still a reader's note, not everybody that is a Mason is necessarily some evil oligarch. In fact, most Masons are of the Blue Lodge, which is the first 3 degrees, ending in Master Mason. Now, most Masons believe that Master Mason apparently is the highest degree they can achieve, and they're honky-dory with that. However, it appears that there are many more levels to Masonry beyond the Blue Lodge, beyond the first 3 degrees. However, those positions are reserved only for the Masons who are clever enough to discern the truth about Masonry, which ultimately ends up being that they worship Jabulon and, for all intents and purposes, worship Lucifer. At any rate, so the President of the Republic was a brick mason. This is going back to the reading of the story. Again, it is just a story. Could be fiction, could be true. It's up to the reader to make that decision, but I found it interesting. So, and anyway, big thanks to John Cooper for pointing this out to me, and Jaron actually brought it to my attention a few weeks ago, and so I was glad to have found the entire set of articles. And so I figured I'd make it, sort of an audiobook format just for the sake of people who don't necessarily like to read, but who enjoy interesting stories. So enough about that little side note. So back to the President of the Republic was a brick mason. Just then, the orchestra, rather the great harmonium, began to play, and the laughter and conversation of the brilliant assemblage drowned into a crash of music grander than anything I had ever heard before. From a tremendous explosion of harmony, it would sink to the softest tones of flute and harp, and then again swell into a crash of melodious sounds, in which were chimes of deep-toned bells, roar of drums, shrieking of horns, and concussion of anvils, dying away again to the delicate, tremulous quaver of a single violin string. And as these divine strains from the instruments rose and fell in the production of the musical drama, the theme was illustrated by a wonderful, spectacular view projected on the curtain of the stage. I noticed from the program that this production was the Winter King, and as the fierce north wind howled and shrieked and moaned in the musical passages, the snow fell in the spectacular, and the street-laden trees crashed before the blast. Anon, breakers boomed and thundered on rock-bound shore, and then could be seen dismantled ship drifting to wreck and ruin. Altogether, it was the grandest thing I ever saw, or it seemed to me, that human genius could produce. Another fine effect I noticed was produced by the electric lights set in the dome-shaped ceiling. These lights were covered by partly colored glass globes that at intervals revolved, throwing every shade of beautiful light over the audience with changing and shifting tints, weirdly beautiful. The intention of this, I surmised, was to heighten the illusion by thus eliminating the audience, making it as strangely unreal as possible. And I might think that's a typo. Instead of eliminating, it might mean illuminating, but what do I know? The audience, making it as strangely unreal as possible. It was successful, and in all, beautiful beyond my powers of description. You not only heard, you saw and felt. With the dying away of the last deep roll of thunder, the sinking of the wind to a sighing zephyr, the subsidence of the black, white-manned sea, the sweet warbling of a bird that seemed to carol its song in an ecstasy of delight that nature's convulsion was past, the grand finale was reached. The sun burst forth as if by magic. The great auditorium was illuminated by a pure white light, bright as day, and then the curtain rose. As it rolled up, a picture was seen in the background, at the sight of which the concourse of 5,000 people rose as one man and waved their handkerchiefs and applauded to the top of their bent. It was a simple picture, and yet it evoked the wildest enthusiasm. Just a backing of sky, and in the foreground a massive iron pillar with a quality of solidity and inertia about it which no words can convey. Overarching the pillar was a rainbow, and on it were inscribed the words, quote, "The state was made for man, not man for the state," end quote. On the pillar was the statue of a man with a hammer poised, and above it floated a blue flag with a white star in the center. This was the device of the Iron Republic, and certainly, if enthusiasm proves anything, it was a loyal audience. I wonder if that was a 5-pointed star or a 6-pointed star, just a reader's commentary. When the cheering finally subsided, a rather stout, awkward-looking gentleman walked out on the stage and was received with an ovation. He appeared to be young, though prematurely bald, and so timid that it was not until after several efforts that he succeeded in finding his voice. When he did, he introduced another gentleman, tall and handsome, as Professor Churchill, the author of The Winter King, and an artist whom we all delight to honor, end quote. The artist received his meed of applause, and bowing with a gratified smile, they both left the platform. "Ah," I said, turning to Professor Morris, "now I perceive that I am indeed in the Iron Republic, for your Churchill would never have gotten off in America without a speech." "Never fear," replied my companion. "We will doubtless have speeches enough before we are through, even in the Iron Republic." End quote. On inquiring who the timid young man was that appeared on the stage first and was received with such applause, I was informed that it was Professor Hallam of the National Conservatory and the greatest musician in the Republic. After this incident, a fine-looking gentleman advanced to the center of the stage in front of the picture, bearing a silver shield on which rested a massive key of gold. I was somehow startled at this lavishness, but I was to learn that my cost, that gold in the country was a vastly different thing from gold in other parts of the world. Walking to front, the gentleman spoke as follows, quote, "Fellow citizens, I have the honor to present to you, through your executive this evening, the keys to this edifice which is to be consecrated to the education, elevation, and happiness of our race. Its foundations are of granite, its walls of marble, its roof of glass and phosphor bronze, imperishable materials, as becomes the temple of an imperishable nation. It is not a monument of dead stones to cover the bones of dead oppressors, as are the granite heaps in Egypt and of Rome, but a living temple made animate by the spirit of art, philosophy, and religion, of which it is to be the concrete body. Its dust may fly on the winds of future ages, or fructify the fields of those whom we will be an ancient race, But virtue is immortal, and the noble passions and ambitions kindled here will live forever, beyond the remorseless touch of time. Fellow citizens, I deliver to you that which is yours, and relinquish all right and claim to it, whatever. Here, a modest-looking gentleman with stooping shoulders and the carriage of a working man mounted the platform amid perfect tumult of applause, and, lifting the key from the shield with a bow, thanked the architect for such he was, in a few well-chosen words, for the skill and painstaking bestowed in the creation of such a work of art, and as that gentleman retired from the stage, turned to the audience and spoke in part as follows, quote, "Fellow citizens, the earth may be likened to a great laboratory where things are made, tested, and improved, and where nothing is perfect enough as yet to be stamped with the seal of immortality. So far, eternal power seeks no permanent form. Changeless in its nature, it is most changeful in its manifestations and expresses itself in a million forms that wax and wane and pass away, leaving the spirit of power to enter other bodies. Under the dust of the moistless desert we find the track of the long-perished river. Beneath the greenest landscape lie other landscape buried. So in the realm of thought, delve where we may, in literature, art, philosophy, or religion, we evermore turn up the ashes of things that were, and so in turn shall the dust of things which are slip through time's fingers and find the roots of things to be. As genius molds and remolds the pliant clay till the perfect form is reached, as the eagle with each revolution in his circling flight mounts upward to the sun, so nature in her ceaseless evolutions grows more perfect with each succeeding change. The earth-born wrestler in the Greek mythology was thrown down but sprang up, re-strengthened by contact with his Mother Earth. And so death levels all, only that life may spring up in new and more perfect forms. The awful mystery of life and death, of darkness and light, of good and evil, we may not understand. And again, we're sort of talking about this whole duality thing, so I don't know. But we know that there were two lions matched strength to strength and died in combat, sprang up two lilies, fragrant and fair, and enriched by the dead carcasses of savage beasts, they grew luxuriantly tall and beautiful. And this to me is very much like the whole phoenix story, which rises from the ashes of the dead phoenix, which is sort of the whole Illuminati New World Order symbolism, out of order comes chaos, or the rebirth out of death. And it seems to me the author of this book is including a lot of these sort of twin towers or opposing ideas, the two towers they've got, which are called Jachin and Boaz. So, enriched by the dead carcasses of savage beasts, they grew luxuriantly tall and beautiful. Thus does nature, through the mysteries of death, effect the transmutation of savageness and strength into sweetness and beauty. And thus do her analogies teach us that the evils and inharmonies of the present time shall combat each other to death, and through death transmute their undying forces into harmonious forms of beauty. It's a very idealistic thought. And so shall the flight of the arrow become the spray of the fountain, the sweep of the broadsword, the song of the circling scythe, the tumult of water, the shouting of children at play. We give this introduction of the President because it was so fine of itself and so impressive and effective in its simple and modest delivery. In his further remarks he dwelt on the affairs of the Republic, the prosperity of the people, and the possibilities of the future. It was a splendid address of 20 or 30 minutes, after which there was more music, the reading of a poem composed by a local poet for the occasion, and an address by the burgomaster. There were also remarks by a celebrated actor, and the program closed with a beautiful anthem by Professor Hallam and an invocation and benediction by a venerable old gentleman who I understood my countrymen to say was a professor of Christian philosophy. At the conclusion of the exercises, Captain Brent and myself were presented to the President and had a few minutes of pleasant conversation with him. He informed us that he was made aware of our arrival in a few minutes after we had come ashore, and would have telephoned us greeting, but that he anticipated the pleasure of meeting us in a few hours. He tendered Captain Brent and myself the freedom of the Republic and invited us to accompany him to the capital the next day. The invitation was warmly seconded by Professor Morris, who commanded us to make his house our home during the visit. Being desirous above all things to see the country, I accepted their invitations and parted from them with the understanding that I should meet them at the office of the affable Director of Navigation the next afternoon. On our return to the vessel, Captain Brent and myself discussed the situation thoroughly, and decided, so far as the ship was concerned, to leave everything in statu quo for the time being. I instructed him to pay the crew up to date and without canceling articles, to give them all shore leave for 30 days, with the privilege of going where they pleased in the country, or remaining on the vessel at their option. He, with the steward, was to remain on board. The next morning I went out to look up a bank with the view of converting some of my gold into money of the realm. Failing to find any such institutions, or even to make anyone understand my wants, I had recourse to my countrymen. Professor Morris, who had been thoughtful enough to give me his address the night before, I informed him of my desire, at which he looked grave and asked me what my resources were. I told him that I had enough to answer all my present wants, having about $50,000 in American gold in my safe aboard the vessel, and that I wanted was to find a safe bank where I could deposit it and convert it into money of the country as occasion should require. "My dear sir," said the professor seriously, "I fear that your greatest disappointment with the country will be when I enlighten you on the subject of your inquiry. Such things as banks are unknown in the financial system of this country." "But surely," said I, "there are places of exchange where I can convert American gold into the currency of the country." "No," he replied, "for the simple reason that gold is not money in this country, and is convertible into money on the basis of its intrinsic value, as iron, coal, and other commodities are." "I understand that," I interrupted, "and in that your system is not really different from ours. Gold money with us is based on the intrinsic value of the metal, and therefore differs from silver and other forms of currency. That is the beauty of the gold standard to which the United States is destined," which we don't have anymore, by the way. Reader's note. We don't have a gold standard anymore. It's just backed on faith, and it's backed on debt owed by the government to the private group of banks called the Federal Reserve Banks, which are exactly as federal as McDonald's or the Kitty Cat Porn Ranch in Nevada. So just saying on that. That is the beauty of the gold standard to which the United States is destined. There is no artificial or fiat value inherent in it. Consequently, it is worth as much in any other country as it is in ours. "Yes," replied the professor with a smile, "it is worth as much in any other country where it is used for money, but you must know, my dear sir, that it is from its use as money that it derives its chief value. In this country it is never used for money, and its intrinsic value is only what it derives from its utility in other respects, the same as tin, iron, or copper. It is not half so useful as any of these, but it is much scarcer and is relatively higher on that account. Still, you must be terribly disappointed when I tell you that what was a handsome fortune for you in America is comparatively an insignificant sum in the Iron Republic. There will not be the slightest trouble, though, in converting it into money of the realm, and you need have no hesitancy about doing it, as you can reconvert it into gold at the same rate at any time. In other words, you can deposit it in the government exchange, receiving its value in currency with the privilege of exchanging the currency for gold again at any time. Come, said he, let us go down and arrange it at once. Going out, we took a kind of horseless cab and soon alighted before, by far, the largest building I had yet seen. Rather, I should say we were alighted in it, for the streets passed through the building, as did a number of railroads. Going into an office, the professor walked up to the counter and asked the price of gold. The clerk in charge handed out an official sheet that looked like a market report, and with his pencil pointed to the quotation of gold on the list. We learned from this that it was worth 2 diems, pronounced diems or diems, per pound. A simple calculation showed my $50,000 of American coin to be worth about $666. Another sort of symbol in there. I was dumbfounded. In a single moment I felt a handsome fortune swept from my hands. I actually cowered as from a blow. My companion must have noted it, for he slapped me on the shoulder and rallied me, saying that I was richer in the Iron Republic without a dollar than I would be anywhere else in the world with $1,000,000. $600? Why, I said despairingly, that is not enough to support me until I can find work. Why, my friend, that is enough to keep you in comfort for several years, and there is your vessel worth 10,000 diems, at least, enough to make you a very rich man indeed in this country. After ascertaining the market value of my gold, it took but a short time to have it brought to the government exchange and weighed in. Before the metal was weighed in, the clerk in charge asked me for my seal. In turn, I looked inquiringly and rather helplessly to Professor Morris, who explained that I was not a citizen and therefore had no seal. This seemed likely to prove a fatal hitch in the proceedings, for the clerk said it was impossible for him to certify me unless I had a seal. After consultation, it was arranged by having Professor Morris deposit it for me. It may be supposed that I was an interested observer of these conventionalities, so entirely new and strange to me. Drawing what appeared to be a disc of hard rubber about the size of a 25-cent piece from his purse, my friend dropped it into the slot of a registering device attached to the scales. The clerk in charge pressed a lever, and a small card fell out along with the professor's seal. Placing the seal in his pocket, Professor Morris handed me the card. On one side was a facsimile of the seal, a circular ornamented border, and within the words, W.A. Morris, American citizen by grace 1863. On the reverse was stamped in figures that cut into the card the exact weight of the metal. The entire business was transacted without the agent of the government ever touching the gold or the receipt for it. From the scales, the metal was passed to the assayer nearby, who put a stamp under the weight, indicating its fineness, and then it was tagged and carried to a vault-like storeroom. Passing to another department, for the place was arranged similar to a great bank, the professor laid down his card and had counted out to him a pile of bills, something like bank checks, ruled crossways on the back to hold many signatures, aggregating 654 diems, the alloy in the gold making it worth 12 diems less than the quoted price. These bills were handed over to me and the business was completed. Now, I think it's odd that he received, instead of 666 dioms, 654, which is 12 less than 666. So